second issue. When we give out messages that often involve humanitarian causes, disease or hunger or malnutrition, one of the rules of thumb we often use is the idea that we need to communicate how big the problem is. And at a certain level, that's perfectly logical, because if you can say 10 people are suffering from a problem, or 1 million people are suffering from a problem, clearly telling people that 1 million people are suffering from a problem ought to be a more effective message, because many more people are in need of help, right? Think about the message. Hunger and malnutrition are still the #1 risks to health worldwide, a sense of the scale of the problem. Or think about this. Every 3.6 seconds, a person dies of hunger. 75% of them are children. Now, in the gap between my last two sentences, if that last statistic is correct, someone in the world may have died of hunger. Why are you all still sitting here listening to me? Isn't there something more important that you should be doing? I just told you a horrifying statistic, and if the statistic is true, it suggests that on a routine, everyday basis, huge numbers of people are dying from something that is entirely preventable. Go back to that guinea pig inside your head and ask yourself, at one level, you hear the statistic and you say, my God, that's appalling. But that doesn't necessarily translate into your saying, I want to do something about it. So recognizing that there's a problem doesn't necessarily translate into action. And often what we're looking for is not just intellectual, someone being in intellectual sympathy to what you're saying, but what we're looking for is action. So the philosopher Peter Singer has an interesting dilemma. He said, imagine that you're walking by the side of a pond and you see a child drowning. Now, you can jump into the pond and save the child at no risk to your own life. So there's no risk that you face in jumping into the pond. However, if you stop to untie your shoes before you jump into the pond, the child will probably drown. So you don't have time to untie your shoes. And you happen to be wearing a very fine pair of shoes that cost $200. Would you save the child, or would you save your shoes? Now, when you pose that question to most people say, well, of course I would jump in the pond. A child's life is clearly more important than a pair of shoes. So if that's the case, Singer says, why is it that so many fewer of us, or far fewer of us, are willing to write a check for $200 that could save the life of a child halfway around the world? Even when you're absolutely sure the money will be well spent, it's going to a charity with impeccable integrity, even when you're absolutely sure that $200 could indeed save the life of a child, why is it that fewer of us are willing to write that check than to jump in the pond? Singer's point, and it's absolutely right, is that the two issues are identical. In both cases, you're weighing the life of a child versus $200. So over the years, psychologists have explored ideas such as the diffusion of responsibility, which is that many people are potentially responsible for that child over there. I am personally responsible for the child over here. So right now, if I happen to keel over and fall on the ground, you wouldn't just sit there watching me. You would actually jump up and do something. You would actually call 911 or run up to me and say, do you need help? So when something is immediate before us, it's visceral, we're much more likely to act. So in my book, The Hidden Brain, I explore in one chapter another idea which might explain why it is we're more likely to act in one situation and not in the other. And I call it the telescope effect, which is when you think about what it is that causes people to act, causes people to get up and do something, right? Acting compassionately or acting empathetically requires putting yourself in someone else's shoes. What happens if you're asked to put yourself not in someone else's shoes, but in 10 people's shoes, or 1 million people's shoes? One of the facets of the way compassion works in the mind is that it works best when it can focus on a single individual. That compassion works when you can target it to a single person. That paradoxically, telling you about 100 people in need of help might induce you to do much less than telling you about one person in need of help. So, in my book, I write about the story about an Indonesian tanker. It was a diesel tanker that roamed the Pacific Ocean. There were about 12 people on board with a dog, the captain's puppy. A fire broke out on the tanker, and the tanker, they lost all communication, all navigation, and so they were adrift on the Pacific Ocean. No one knew where they were. After about 3 weeks, a cruise ship came and rescued the crew on the tanker. They happened to come by. But in the confusion involved in the rescue, the puppy got left behind on the tanker. So as the cruise ship pulled away, passengers heard the sound of barking, and they said there's a dog left behind on the tanker. So the cruise ship comes back to Hawaii, and the passenger on the cruise ship calls the Hawaii Humane Society, and the Humane Society says, we have to do something about this puppy that's adrift on this tanker on the Pacific Ocean. So they talk about this, they try and build up publicity. It really catches fire. Donations come in from across the United States, from foreign countries. Some of the checks are for thousands of dollars at a time. They create this search box because they say based on where the tanker was last seen, we have a 360,000 square mile area in which this tanker could be. And so they press, radar and other things to try and find the tanker. They go on for days, they're not able to find it. There's huge pressure on the US government to act, but the US government says, listen, this tanker is in international waters. There's really nothing that we can do about it, but the pressure starts to mount so much. So the US Navy, under the guise of a training mission, says, all right, we'll start looking for the tanker. The Coast Guard eventually gets involved. They dispatch these very high-tech C-130 aircraft with forward-looking radar systems. And eventually they find the tanker. It's called the Inseco. And the pilots on the plane, as they fly by the tanker, they see a little blur running across the deck of the tanker, which means that the puppy is still alive. So they don't have food, so they drop their lunches on the tanker, their granola bars and oranges, and so that the puppy can survive. So now they come back, they tell people about this, interest in the puppy soars to historic proportions, immense pressure on the US government to act. So finally the Coast Guard and the US government say, there's actually an environmental reason why we should get involved in this, because the tanker is carrying diesel. And at this point, the tanker is so far outside the search box, it's about 2,500 miles from the US mainland, drifting west. And they say that if it drifts further west by hundreds of miles, it could run aground on this very tiny speck in the Pacific Ocean called Johnston Atoll, and it could harm the marine life there. And that's an environmental reason why we should get involved and retrieve the tanker. Now, what they don't mention is that for many, many years, the US government used Johnston Atoll as a testing ground for nuclear weapons. And so the island is contaminated with plutonium and uranium, and they have nerve agents and sarin. But of course, the diesel on this tanker is just too deadly for poor little Johnston Atoll. Anyway, so they find the tanker. The dog is still alive. They bring the tanker back to Hawaii. This is a picture of the dog being welcomed back with a lei. They play Who Let the Dogs Out as the dog comes back in. Anyway, in the course of this whole rescue mission, at least $100,000 was spent on rescuing this puppy, probably far more than that, probably many times that when you factor in the human costs and the logistical costs and so on. And so for the cost of saving this one puppy, quite obviously, thousands of dogs could have been saved for the same amount of money. Thousands of dogs, right? But that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen precisely because of the telescope effect. That the reason we cared about this puppy, so people say, why don't we care about the child who's halfway around the world? And people say the child is far away. Well, the dog was far away too. The dog was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This was a foreign dog, actually. It wasn't even an American dog, right? So it's not just that we care about Americans. The argument is that we don't care about foreigners, we care only about Americans. No, this was a foreign dog in international waters. But it was one dog. It was one dog with a face, with a story, with a life history, and that allows us to wrap our compassion around it. And it activates our compassion in ways that if there had been 100 dogs on that very same tanker, we would have been far less likely to have gotten involved. So when you're communicating messages, and many nonprofit groups, I think, understand this, it actually is ineffective to communicate scale. That scale might actually become a disincentive to act, which is why when I often get letters in the mail asking me for support, I'm often not told, 1 million people need help. I'm shown a photograph of a single person, and I'm told, your donations can help this one person do something, that this one person can be helped or saved. I'm much more likely to act in that situation. I'm going to skip over the video here in the interest of time. We can come back to it during the Q&A if necessary. But I want to go to the third topic.